we landed in Zanzibar at 4 a.m. And I promise you, the feeling that we all felt, but especially me, was like a majestic feeling. Like, I can't put it into words. I didn't know whether to cry. I didn't know whether to laugh. I didn't know whether to kiss the ground. That's how you feel. It was like a surreal feeling, like, this is where I belong. This is where I'm supposed to be. This is where I come from. And quite frankly, this is something I had actually dreamed of since I was a child, was going back to Africa or going to Africa. So there was a lot of emotions tied to it. I was scared, happy, nervous, because for many Black Americans, Africa represents something deeper than just travel. A lot of us don't know exactly where we come from, but we know at some point we came from Africa. My first time in Africa was during the middle of a global pandemic, and I was responsible for a group trip with 25 people on a continent I had never been to before. My family thought it was dangerous. Travel was uncertain, and honestly, I didn't know what I was walking into. But somehow, that trip ended up completely changing my life. Because when most Americans travel to Africa for the very first time, they usually go somewhere like South Africa or Ghana. But my first trip to the continent was to a place most people had barely heard of at the time, Zanzibar. And when I landed there at 4 o'clock in the morning, something happened that I still think about to this very day. Because that moment is the reason I eventually came back and built a life there. Looking back now, I realized that trip was the beginning of everything that came next. But at that time, all I knew is that I had just brought 25 people halfway across the world to a place I had never experienced myself. And I had no idea what we were about to walk into. And the truth is, the moment that changed everything didn't happen the way I expected it to. So the year was 2022, and this was my first time ever traveling to Africa. So a lot of the questions that come up, especially during that time, because we were in the middle of a pandemic, was, immunization. Do you have to have the C-19 shot? What are the health and safety concerns, especially in the middle of a global pandemic? And also, travel was very unpredictable at that time, with flights and logistics. And then to make it even more pressure, I had the responsibility of 25 other American people who had never been to Africa before. So I had to lead that group and also learn for myself at the same time, because I had never personally visited Zanzibar before. One of the major things that was a big concern was travel logistics. A lot of people had not traveled that far. I believe there was only maybe 2 people on the trip who had ever traveled that far before. I had to organize flights. I built systems around people connecting at certain locations so they could fly together. A pandemic on top of people having so many uncertainties in Africa, it caused a lot of nervousness. And at the time, there were no direct flights. You had to take multiple flights and have long layovers. For example, I was coming from Southern California, so I had to take 4 flights to get to Zanzibar. And one of those flights had like a 12-hour layover. So there was a lot of logistics involved. Also, another concern we had was the Zanzibar strong Muslim culture. A lot of people on the trip were asking me, do we have to be fully covered? Is it okay if we wear swimsuits? Because we hear a lot of, negative things about if you're not respectful with your clothing and the strong Muslim cultures. So at that time, tourism was much smaller and it was less familiar in the Zanzibar area. So I had to work a lot with people on the ground that I really didn't know, that, you know, I just got their phone number and were introduced. On top of that, there was a language barrier because their main language is Swahili, my main language is English. So it was late nights and a lot of planning that went into it. And then on top of that, I didn't have a lot of support. My family and friends were wondering why I would even attempt to do a trip like this. They were worried about safety, not only from the pandemic standpoint, but, you know, the unknowns of traveling all the way to Africa. So I was stepping into a completely unknown situation with a lot of responsibility, which caused a lot of pressure for me. So that moment of realizing that I was actually there and arriving at 4 a.m., it was still dark outside, so we couldn't see anything when we originally arrived.
All right, we just touched down in Zanzibar. So here we go.
It was a feeling and a moment of something that really felt bigger than just arriving somewhere new, because I had traveled across the world before. I've been to a lot of other places prior to going to Africa, and I made that point in 2022 that I'm not traveling to another place on this globe until I make it back to the motherland. So after arriving at like 4 a.m., we left the airport probably about 6 a.m. So now the sun is starting to come out. And that's one of the most beautiful things in Zanzibar, is the sunrises and the sunsets. But as we're driving, I'm looking left and right, and I'm starting to see things that I've seen before. Buses, transit systems, the way some of the homes looks, the way some of the streets looked, driving through the greenery. I said, this looks like Jamaica. The tropical island environment, the relaxed pace of life, but also just so many people moving around. It was like, man, this feels familiar. But that was also the very first time I had heard Swahili spoken in real life. And I started to see the clothing and some of the differences, seeing the African, Arabic, and Indian influence that created Swahili culture was so intriguing to me. When we stopped on the side of the road, everyone was welcoming and saying habari, which means welcome. And instantly I realized that what I am experiencing and what I am feeling is absolutely the opposite of what we have been warned about in the media in America. And at that very moment, I knew I had been lied to. And honestly, that moment is why I created something for people who are curious about visiting Africa for the first time. Because there are a lot of things I wish I understood before I came here. So I put together a free first-time Africa travel guide that walks through what to expect, how to plan your trip, and where to start. So we arrived at our beachfront resort and the trip goes beautifully. I, of course, am a little ran ragged because I'm responsible for 25 people, but the experience is absolutely amazing. It's such a beautiful place. So the night before we're scheduled to leave, a colleague and I are just walking down the beach at like 1 a.m. and it's calm. So if you know Zanzibar, you know that the tide goes out at night. So you can literally walk into the ocean for miles and miles and miles. So we're just walking and I'm feeling this extreme sense of calm and relaxation. And I'm just reflecting on the trip and, you know, seeing the Maasai tribe and, you know, going to the spice farm and really experiencing Africa for what it actually is and not what we were told. And realizing that there is just something so special about this place. It felt different. It's this sense that this place is just more than a trip for me. At that very moment, I realized that this place is going to become a very, very important part of my life. And I look at my colleague and I literally tell him, I said, nothing is ever going to be the same after this. And that moment planted the seed for every single thing that came after that. And at the time, I didn't fully understand what I meant. I thought I was just talking about the trip. Looking back now, that moment was the beginning of something much bigger. That first visit to Zanzibar opened my eyes to a completely different pace of life, a different culture, and honestly, a level of peace I had never experienced before. And it left me with questions I couldn't ignore. Questions about what life could look like outside of everything I had always known. What I didn't realize then was how much that moment would stay with me. It didn't feel like the end of a trip. It felt like the beginning of something. And the next time I returned to Zanzibar, I didn't come back as a visitor. I came back as an investor. How that happened and everything that came with that decision is a story I'll share in the next video.